Thank you for joining us. I think we can go ahead and get started now. So thank you for tuning in today for this conversation about diversity, objectivity, and journalistic integrity in partnership between Forbes and Emory University. I'm Catherine Love. I'm a journalist and senior manager here at Forbes. We have a terrific slate of panelists joining us today, spanning academia, media, law, and government. We wanted to bring together these individuals and this audience of students to consider changes in the media landscape and the state of the industry that many of these audience members, the students, will be entering in the near future. We traditionally think of journalists as objective, as reporting both sides of a story, unaffected by personal opinion or agenda or affiliation. But more and more partisan media outlets and partisan narratives have emerged with the ability to reach large groups of the public and to influence opinion, to unite or to divide. So what has become the relationship between journalists and social action? Is there still objectivity, or has the media landscape transitioned from reporting information to establishing the contours of public debate? What are the goals of journalism today? In the next hour or so, we will dive into these big questions, hearing from two panels. One panel focused on covering politically controversial topics, and one panel focused on covering diversity in the media. Let's see. All right. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our first panel. The first panel is titled Covering Politically Controversial Topics, and we have three panelists: Ron Thomas, Associate Professor of English and Director of the Sports Journalism Program at Morehouse College; Nsenga Burton, Co-Director of the Film and Media Management Concentration at Emory University; Ambassador Arthur Koll, former Deputy Director General of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Media and Public Affairs Division; and moderator Ira Bedzow, Miryam Institute Project International Ethics and Leadership at Emory University.
Well, thank you, Catherine. I'm going to get started given the time, and I appreciate your introduction. I'm very excited to be moderating this first panel on politically controversial topics. What I would like to do is I'll focus my questions on individual panelists, but of course, any of the panelists could speak to any of the questions that I'll bring. So, Ron, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind. And I'll start with just, the quick observation that over the past few years, there's been a very explicit shift in journalism away from reporting towards increasing editorializing. I mean, we see this in almost every type of news outlet, but especially in politically controversial or political types of stories. How has this shift either responded to changes in politics or something else? And how do you see it speak to journalistic integrity?
Well, this is I'm really glad to be here, for one. Thanks for inviting me. And this has been sort of a topic of discussion in my classes at Morehouse College, partly also because we recently become a major called Journalism in Sports Culture and Social Justice. And so this topic fits right into particularly the social justice area. I think this is the Trump administration really has been a big challenge, was a big challenge for the media. Because the media has always had a certain politeness, particularly toward presidents. And you could see it sort of, I think back to Trump at the very beginning of his presidency when he talked about the size of his inauguration crowd and said it was much larger than Barack Obama's. And anyone who saw a picture of the crowd knew that was wrong. And I'm sure if you went back to those, the reports on that, journalists might sort of chuckle and say, well, maybe you need to look at different pictures, or that's an exaggeration or misrepresentation. And they would couch that blatant mistake in those sort of softer terms. But after the Trump administration continued to just lie, eventually you saw that the commentators or reporters would just say, that's a lie, and be very, very blatant about that. Not only about Trump, but other assertions by other people in the administration. That was a big step from being the objective reporter to editorializing in a way, to strongly, and expressing an opinion about what was said. And it just was forced because the Trump administration lied so often and so blatantly, and obviously had no embarrassment about it, did not care. So I think that was a major step for journalists to make. And then part of another result of this constant lying by the Trump administration was that the fact checking, the demands on fact checking on the media went way up. It's to a point where everything the Trump administration said had to be fact checked. And I think the best I saw was Daniel Dale at CNN. He did a great job of fact checking and summarizing, let's say after a major press conference or something, going through it and pointing out mistake after mistake, lie after lie in a very rapid but coherent fashion. So the fact checking became much more important. And I'm sure that media outlets devoted many more people to fact checking because of the blatant lies in the Trump administration. So that was something new also for the media.
So do you think that there's a difference between checking facts and correcting facts and providing another perspective or a complementary narrative to what political leaders may be saying? And the difference would be if you have a president that doesn't lie, then fact checking goes away and reporting goes back to status quo ante. Whereas if editorializing then goes into, it's not simply about checking facts, but also making sure that other ways of seeing the same story comes up, then that might be here to stay. So how does the editorializing and the increasing editorializing in news not only been a response to the previous administration, but potentially might continue into the future?
I think what you'll see is less emphasis on this fact checking because there's so many lies out there. But I think you will see a carryover in the overall style of journalism. I don't think we'll ever sort of turn back the clock to this sort of neutrality as the way to go as a standard. Let me put it another way. I think there will now be more editorializing than there was before, but I don't think it will be as much as as during the Trump administration, because it just won't be necessary. It'll be more talking about policies and approaches to problems and different ways of looking at things, as opposed to having to knock down lies. So, and it's sort of what happened after Watergate. I mean, Watergate changed journalism forever. And one of the ways it did was to just stronger, deeper investigative reporting on politics. So I think this will, in a way, have a similar effect.
Do you think that the shift changes the ways politically controversial topics are covered across the board, or do you think it's especially relevant to the way minoritized or marginalized communities are represented politically and in reporting and in the media?
Well, I think one of the things, because of the blatant racism, again, by the Trump administration, a couple of things happened. One, Trump himself highlighted Black reporters, particularly women reporters, who are covering the White House. And three who quickly come to mind are April Ryan, Yamiche Alcindor, and Abby Phillips. And he would just pick them out for his insults. And they would have been answering the questions and seen in press conferences and so on, no matter who the president was, because they were White House correspondents. But the way Trump attacked them, and obviously it was racially motivated, brought them to the public eye. And so it really highlighted them and improved their careers, I would say. Abby Phillips ended up with her own show, and Yamiche is all over TV. So I think that's one thing. Another thing that happened was you saw Black reporters, again, step away from their sort of neutral, objective stance at some points and strongly express their opinion. And two instances that I remember, one was when Trump was talking about Representative Cummings, who died. And he talked about Baltimore and talked about it being in his district in Baltimore, and talked about it being infested. And Victor Blackwell, who's one of the morning anchors for CNN, was commented on that. And in his commentary, he became very emotional. You know, he talked about the fact that he grew up in Cummings district, and he knew a lot of people who lived there who were just family people, hardworking people. And he resented the fact that Trump often talked about the districts of Black and Hispanic representatives as being infested, as if the people there are animals, insects. And so he almost came to tears talking about that. And then I saw sort of a similar thing with Jeff Bennett, who's a Morehouse graduate, who was an NBC and just finished his time as an MSNBC White House correspondent. He was talking about the killing of Elijah McClain, the young teenager in Aurora, Colorado, who was jumped on by police after someone just said he was looked sketchy as he was walking home from a convenience store. And he was killed by a chokehold. And in talking about that, Bennett became very emotional, and I could see why, because he ended what he was saying by saying, if Elijah McClain isn't safe, who is? And what Jeff was representing, what I think every Black man saw in that incident and others, which is that could have been us. You know, just happened to be Elijah McClain, could have been us, my brother, you know, any Black man. And so the fact that more Black journalists got a chance to cover these events was really good. But the other thing is that they were moved sometimes to personalize the experience of covering what was happening and speak about it from the heart, as opposed to just from a reporter's objective perspective. And so, or supposedly objective perspective. So I think that was something that was new. And I think that's important because this is where diversity in hiring in journalism is important, because no matter how sincere and sympathetic a white journalist could be, they could not feel the emotion that a Victor Blackwell and Jeff Bennett felt, because they couldn't be Black.
Ron, I appreciate this. I think this actually goes back to what Nsenga is doing with the Burton Wire, where the Burton Wire, obviously Nsenga, correct me if I'm wrong, but you really allow readers and those who watch your YouTubes and your interviews really see stories and what is important for stories for the people of the African diaspora. And it looks like there's a new trend in reporting and in media about looking at the story or the report, not simply from an objective point of view, but from a multiplicity of insider views.
Yes.
What do you think about that in terms of its approach to journalism? Does it put the onus on the reader or the consumer of news to make sure that they have a various outlets that they go to, or what are some of the benefits and potential detriments of that type of journalistic platform?
Thank you, Ira. Yeah, I think that the benefits far outweigh the negatives. It's not like this type of journalism, activist journalism is what it's called, or advocate journalism is what it's called, is new and has not been occurring previously. You saw a lot of it in the Black press, which is over, almost 200 years old. I think 174 years old this year. You saw a lot of that in women's outlets, alternative LGBTQ publications and things of that nature. Where you can have people who are reporting who are culturally competent. That's what Ron is talking about, right? When you have Black reporters covering Black issues, you want them to have some level of cultural context and you want them to be culturally competent. So I think that the benefits are great. And you're seeing, lots of online news publications adding social justice reporters, or what they're calling social reporters, because I think what we've learned in recent years that when you have a platform like this, and I think it's due to the technological change in the industry, that the need for responsibility and accountability is greater because the reach is so much further and the damage can be quicker. And I think that's what we have learned, which is why, if traditional publications like the Wall Street Journal, has a very robust ethics department, and they are really looking at every single thing that is coming out of that publication. NPR has issued a statement that says that their journalists can be advocates and they can participate in marches and they can let people know who they're voting for, which is something that just was not general practice. Hank can speak to that too, and Ron, and I'm sure Arthur as well. Just was not a general practice for many years because, the idea was that you cannot be objective and you cannot report on something in an objective fashion if people know your political affiliation, if they know your cultural interests, if they know your religion, if they know these different things about you. When you're African American, a Black person like me, I can't hide that. I can't put that away or tuck it away, which is why Black women journalists specifically, and I'm talking about what Ron was talking about, were really, I think, really put in peril but in this last presidency. So I think that the benefits are greater, right? You get to have, as you call it, or as we would call it in academia, intertextual references, right? You get to have that cultural competency. You get to have that cultural context. And all of that is needed in this era. I think the negatives are that we have not done a good job of educating people. So people don't necessarily understand there's a difference between, the reason why there's an op-ed page is that was the place for opinion, right? There's a reason why we have news, reported news, different types of news stories and what have you, and why you have the editorial, the op-ed page in newspapers and news publications. So because of technology, because of the cultural shifts, people are less likely to be able to delineate between the two. And so you could be offering your perspective, which is completely uninformed and not fact-based, but someone who doesn't know you or doesn't know your background or doesn't know what you represent or where you come from or anything about you might take it as fact. So that's the danger and the challenge. But I think we can do a much better job of media literacy and teaching people what news is. I don't think people even know really what news is, what qualifies it as news, what news gathering is, what gatekeeping is, these very basic things that are basic to people in our generation. And people who grew up with traditional news publications and, the three networks, even before CNN, and those who grew up with CNN, but they just, most people are not being educated and have not been exposed to because they're curating their own experiences. And so I think if we do that and we make sure that it becomes a part of not only private schools like Emory or, our flagships like UGA's outstanding Grady School of Journalism and in communication, but like really goes into public school systems and larger school systems, I think we can do something to help people learn how to tell the difference between fact and fiction, and why it's important that your news organizations really focus on the fact and let you sift that information for yourself and make your own determinations.
Well, no, look, I love it because, as an educator, I always think people need to be more educated because, that's my axe to grind.
Yes.
But, I would say, and this is, I don't know how to deal with this yet. I'm still struggling in terms of there's a difference between people's experiences and knowing that different experiences will give different perspectives. But there's also the difficulty of knowing that language is, especially today, although one could say always was, language connotes political and social positions very strongly. Like the term in which you use, or the term which you choose to use will also frame the issue immediately by using that term versus another one. So in terms of not only educating the public, but educating future journalists, especially looking for journalistic integrity, how do you look at the types of language choices people use or you should teach people to use with regards to issues of political and moral importance?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. And I think, and my point that I was making earlier that I want to reiterate now is that we have to take the educating that's happening in our classrooms with our student journalists and take it out of the classrooms and make sure it meets greater population. But you have to work on it, right? You have to actually write. Writers become better writers. You know this, Ira. The more you write, the better you become at it. The more you report, the more feedback you get. the more you learn about what language you should be using, what language is found to be offensive, which, can take away from the story that you're trying to tell because you're still using a term to describe a whole group of people that is no longer accurate or preferred by that group of people. So instead of focusing on the information that's within that story that's necessary for our communities, people focus on the language. So you are absolutely correct. Language is powerful. And we have to make it a priority to understand and learn the language of the groups we represent. I don't think that, although I would prefer for certain groups to represent other groups, particularly in news. So for example, a Jewish reporter covers a synagogue. You want that for many different reasons, because they have the insider information, they are of the same background, you know that they're going to treat it with some cultural context and with some sensitivity and things of that nature. But anybody, you should be able to send anybody to a synagogue to report on it and know that they are culturally aware, that they have that cultural sensitivity, and that they have what they need in order to get the story done. The problem is that has not always been the case, and that and reporters have not always been held accountable by those who are in power, because they haven't seen it as something that's important, right? Those are niche publications. That is a special interest story, not that it is part of the normal and mainstream news cycle, and should be. So I think that language has to be learned. Culture has to be learned. Culture, as you know, is handed down, from generation to generation. And so when that culture is handed down and there's something that doesn't fit with this next generation, we have to address that. We have to think about it. We have to be more compelled to think about the language that we use. And so when you get feedback, and that's what's beautiful about this generation of news making, which people don't really like, a lot of people don't, but I do. When you get feedback from people, like, a lot of comments are terrible, but some comments really tell you what you need to know, right? You learn that, oh, that is not a word that is appreciated by this community. That is not a term that is appreciated by this community. We think of it as new to us, but this community has been celebrating this, important date like Juneteenth, for 100 years. So it's not new. So please stop calling it new. It's something we've been doing for 100 years, and we want to bring it to the masses or the mainstream. And so language is important. It is critical. We need to do it in our classrooms, but I still argue that knowledge has got to leave the classroom and make it into the community. And so we educators, educational institutions, have to do a better job of connecting with the communities in which we reside and in which we serve. And I think that will help ultimately.
I appreciate that very much. Both given what you've said and what Ron has said in terms of the relationship between media and news and the public, in terms of public information, public decision-making, raising the level of public discourse. Ron also mentioned this, that there's a very intimate relationship, whether for good or for bad, it depends on the administration apparently, between government and media as well, or news and politics. We're lucky here that we can not only talk about this from the journalistic side, but we can also talk about it from the government side. So from this, I want to actually direct my question to Arthur and ask, given your experience in government and politics, how does activist or advocacy journalism affect the ways in which government engages with the press and or uses the press to communicate its agenda to the public? You're muted, Arthur.
Now, thank you for having me on this panel, and it's an honor. As you said, I am a former diplomat, so I wasn't in politics, I was in diplomacy, although, of course, I worked with politicians, and in many ways, it is a similar way in which diplomacy or government work vis-a-vis media. So you asked about activist journalism, and it brings me to the previous discussion regarding objectivity of journalists and journalism. And as it comes from me as a diplomat who was in charge of public diplomacy, I have to say all along my career, I learned that I should not expect even-handedness. I should expect two things. One is fairness. So when it comes to the reporting of events, both sides should be reported in a fair way. And when it comes to the editorials and op-ed pages, there, of course, you try and influence those who write the opinion papers to understand your position, maybe to stand by your position. So there is a difference between the editorials and the op-ed pages and the reporting. Government, I'm sure every government, definitely the Israeli government and Ministry of Foreign Affairs paid and continues to pay a lot of attention to how it is being portrayed by the international media and tries to influence it, of course. And it has to be divided between two types of times. One, like now, there is no particular crisis, there is no particular conflict, although unfortunately in our region, from time to time, there is an eruption of violence, and that is when normally a lot of attention is being paid to our little dot on the map. And so you try in between these conflicts to maintain as good as possible contact and educate. You talked about earlier about educating the public. We try to also educate the journalists, educate them about the situation, the complexities, bring them over to see with their own eyes the reality, which many times is very different from afar than knowing it from close. And in addition, there is something new that has developed in the last few years and is dramatic in my view, and it has to be mentioned, and that is that in addition to what is called the traditional media, radio, television, newspapers, we have something totally new, which is social media, the new media. And if governments want to, in the past, governments talk to the public through the media, the traditional media. Now they have the ability to talk to the public by bypassing the traditional media, and they have the ability to talk directly to every single person around the globe. That is something new. It's a challenge, but it also goes the other way around. The people used to be on television, on radio, or the local newspaper. Now, many, and particularly the younger generations, do not necessarily get their news from those traditional medias, but from social media. And the last thing that I want to add on this is that if government wants to influence the agenda, governments normally want to set the agenda, to influence the agenda. Journalists want to challenge what government try to do. Now, there is a new element, and that is the fact that actually every person with a cell phone is a journalist. And not only is a journalist because every person has the ability to take a picture of something that is happening right next to him, write a few lines and spread it. And it can be, it depends who it is, but it can be an influencer. And that influencer is followed by many more people than many of the traditional papers. So you have a new type of group that you don't know, or you should actually know, but it is a challenge how to approach, how to converse with them directly, and how to respond to what they say. And this new media also brings up a lot of fake news, which is a challenge by itself.
Arthur, you really set up the next panel very, very nicely. But before we go to the next panel, I do have another question for you. When looking to balance a government's efforts on what type of media they should be responding to, engaging with, and so forth, what is the balance, or what is the priorities between focusing on domestic journalists, however you want to define it, or the international press, or the foreign press in terms of the standing for the issues that the government is trying to put across to the public?
Yeah, there is a huge difference, and actually, I would say that at least in the case of Israel, there are maybe at least 3 groups which are the target groups, and talking to each of these groups is challenging because many cases the messages are conflicting messages. For example, I just illustrated by an example. Let's say there is a conflict on the borders of Israel with Gaza. So government wants to talk to the Israelis via the local media, and wants to show that Israel is strong and the citizens have no reason to fear, and Israel is going to respond strongly and fiercely to ensure that the Israeli public is supporting of the government actions, is believing that the government is listening and is attentive to its concerns due to the attacks from Gaza and so on. But when it comes to the international media, Israel has a totally different agenda to set. It wants to portray itself as a victim of brutal attacks from Gaza. So if vis-a-vis the Israelis, you want to show strength, vis-a-vis the international media, you want to show yourself as a victim. And if you are a victim, even if you are strong, but still you are being attacked and you want to show the suffering of the civilian population, these are conflicting messages. And there is a third group, and that is the people in Gaza themselves. You want to send a message to the leaders of the Hamas that they can be targeted, that they should beware, and you want to send a message to the population, the uninvolved population in Gaza, to show that they are not the target, it is their leaders. Now, put this all together and you have a very complex situation in which the Israeli government, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Defense Ministry, have to somehow create a strategy, which is not easy, how to deal with each media group, with each target audience. And this is many times a delicate dance.
No, thank you. I would say, only because our time is so short, that the issues with regards to journalistic integrity and objectivity and bringing in new voices so that we can increase public conversation, international conversation for better politics, better government, and better civil society is complicated. I mean, obviously, and we could speak about this for days on end. I appreciate, Arthur, Nsenga, and Ron, your introduction to this topic for our panel. We're going to have many more conversations to tease this out and to educate both ourselves and the public on this. But in the meantime, I do want to pass it back over to Catherine, who can introduce the second panel. And again, thank you. This has been very edifying and educational for me, and I've enjoyed speaking with each of you for the short period of time that I was able to.
Thank you, Ira. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. That was fascinating to hear the different perspectives from both government and from media and academics, how we kind of approach and consider these changes. And I was interested to hear the different kind of the benefits and the challenges of advocacy journalism that Nsenga was talking about, and of social media that Arthur was talking about, that it's actually a huge benefit to newsrooms to be able to reach these audiences directly, but the challenges come with that as well. I also was fascinated that Ron mentioned this course at Morehouse in journalism and sports culture and social action, and that sounds like something I would love to take, very pertinent these days, and would be fascinating. And I wanted to also mention we have the chat open, so if you would like to submit questions to our panelists, feel free to do that in the chat, and we will try to address some during the panel if we have time, or I see Ron answered one directly in there. We will try to do that as well.